Good morning. I think we'll make a start. So my name's Stephen Denning. I'm Director of User Experience at UserVision. So we're a consultancy in Edinburgh, and basically we work with companies in the UK and around the world, helping them to understand and improve the experience that they give to their customers and their users.
Morning, I'm Stephen Drost. I'm the CEO of Stipso. We're a startup. We build marketing software. So I'll be talking about how to incorporate UX into the build of a product.
So I thought we'd just start this morning with a quick video from the lovely people at Google, which I think really just encapsulates why considering the UX is so important.
Okay, don't worry, I'll help. What's your postcode?
Oh, it's GU749ZT.
Welcome back, Nick Forever. Please listen carefully to this bread license agreement before continuing with your purchase of a loaf of bread. If you do not, blah, blah, blah. You also agree not to use any bread-based product for any purposes prohibited by United Kingdom law, including without limitation, design, development, and manufacture of missiles, chemical, nuclear, or biological weapons.
Tick.
I'm afraid you've timed out.
What? Sorry. Hello? Excuse me. Oh, yeah, hey.
Just one loaf, sir?
Yeah, we just...
What's your username?
It's Nick Forever, but number 4, not the...
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm just going to check that you're a real person. Could you say that for me?
It's not even a word.
Okay, how about this one?
You know what, forget it.
Or this one?
Hey, Potter, nice.
You're in.
Great, I'm in.
£8.85.
It's supposed to be 98 pence.
Plus express delivery.
What's that?
Oh, well, it's express delivery. It's fast. So there's, standard.
Standard.
Standard delivery. That's £4.99.
Why?
Bread insurance. You didn't untick the don't decline bread insurance option.
You know what, I think I'll risk it.
It is quite close to the sell-by date.
Don't care.
98 pence it is. If you want to pop back in 5 business days, it'll be ready for your collection.
Well, I need it now, obviously.
Oh, okay. You want the take-home today price? Then that's £3.27.
You know what, I'm going to go.
Come back soon.
I won't.
So it's a silly example, it's a great example of how you can have a perfectly fantastic product, in this case the loaf of bread, but actually the whole experience around getting to that, getting to the content that you want can just be so frustrating. So I thought we'd start just by having a think about user experience as kind of the why and how we design for the emotional response. So we are emotional beings. So Alan Cooper, who's one of the kind of godfathers of user experience, talked about, we've always been emotional and we react to everything that we see in the world in an emotional way, and we have no option. And sometimes those emotions are extreme, sometimes they're subtle, sometimes they're immediate, and sometimes they build up gradually, but they're always there, and they always have an effect on what we're trying to do. Now, obviously, this is the effect that we want for all of our lovely users. We want a positive emotional experience, and we know all the good things that leads to: repeat use, recommendations, increased sales, things like that. I guess as a minimum, we just want to avoid the negative experience. And that's going to lead to complaints, going to competitors, all of that stuff. Increased support. So, that is the user experience. And the user experience is all about understanding and nurturing that emotional response that people have to our products and services. So there's many different ways that we can define user experience, and we've heard some great explanations of that in the previous talk. I think a really simple way of thinking about it is that it's just this overall emotional response, overall experience that somebody has when they're interacting with a product or a service. And I try to simplify it down to this little diagram here. So we think about the user experience sitting on top of these three pillars. So in order to deliver a great user experience, it needs to be useful. So it actually needs to do something that our users, our customers need to achieve. It needs to be usable, so they need to actually be able to achieve that goal efficiently and effectively. And it needs to be compelling. There needs to be an engaging aspect to it. And if you take away any one of these three aspects completely, then the user experience is going to fail. You can have the most beautiful site in the world. If it doesn't do anything, if it doesn't meet the user's need, then they're not going to use it. And likewise, you can have something that's useful and usable, but actually if it isn't engaging, if it doesn't draw the user in, they may just use it once. They may not want to repeat the experience. And we can break this down. You've maybe seen this diagram from Peter Morville, his honeycomb. And what he does is he breaks that down further and thinks about the constituent parts. So if we think about the utility, it's those items in red, so it's useful, it's valuable, it's credible. And then you've got the usability aspects, can they find it? Is it accessible irrespective of any disabilities that someone may have, any impairments? And is it desirable? Does it draw someone in and make them want to talk about it, make them want to repeat that experience? There was a quote by Martin LeBlanc from Icon Finder, and he said, "A user interface is like a joke. If you have to explain it, it's not that good." And I think that kind of encompasses everything there. So what I want to do is quickly go through 6 kind of rules of the road for UX. So first off, I think UX needs to be intentional. So we often find ourselves in this situation in organizations. So we have the systems, we have the technologies, the procedures that have to sit on top of those, and they dictate the touch points that our customers have with the various systems at different times. And those touch points are going to dictate the interactions, and then we have the experience that comes out of the top. But the experience then is a consequence of everything that's gone before it. And what we need to do is kind of flip this around and need to be thinking about the experience first, and then the experience is going to drive, okay, what are the interactions that come off that? Therefore, what are the touch points? Therefore, what are the procedures we need? Therefore, what's the technical architecture that needs to underpin that to deliver the experience? So it's making the experience intentional rather than consequential. And this isn't necessarily an easy thing, but it is necessary. It requires a change in thinking, often requires significant organizational change, and it requires a strategy that centers around the user and the user's needs. Because everything that we do, everything we produce will have a user experience. This isn't an optional bolt-on. Anything we produce will have a user experience, and therefore it's something that we really need to consider up front. And secondly, it sounds obvious, but user experience has to involve the users. You can't do UX without involving users. If you do that, then you're really just setting the product up to fail. But in so many of the organizations that we all work in, there's so many factors that are pulling on the experience and how it's driven. So we'll often have developer or designer-driven experience. And Arnie Lund, who works for General Electric and kind of heads up the user experience there, once said, you've got to know the user, and you've got to know that you are not the user. And particularly those of us who work in technology, we are very atypical of the user base out there. So designing for ourselves can be a fairly risky strategy. There's also the product-driven design. So we have, this could be the technology, the solution looking for a problem. This is where we have a product, we can do it, therefore we must do it. So any of you old enough will remember when WAP first came out, and everyone was like, WAP's fantastic, we can do this, therefore we have to do everything on WAP. And WAP was crap, and nobody used it. And then there's also the hippo-driven experience, the highest paid person in the organization. So this is where you've got somebody who can just shout louder than everybody else, and they will dictate how the product is built and the experience that it's going to deliver. But I think certainly what our job is as user experience professionals, and I think what we all need to be considering, is pulling the user into that conversation. I mean, yes, the business is really important. If a product doesn't meet the business goals, what's the point in doing it? Yes, we've got to make use of the best technology, but we have to draw the user into that equation to get that ideal experience that marries those three areas. The problem is that users don't know what they want. So, really famous quote by Henry Ford saying that if he'd asked his customers what they wanted, they'd have just said a faster horse. People can only frame their requirements based on their experience and their understanding and their worldview. And that isn't necessarily enough to provide the insight that we need in order to design and drive products. So it's the job of UX researchers to dig beneath the surface of that and understand the user behavior and understand those more fundamental needs that the users can't necessarily express themselves. And really the key way of doing this is, as we've just said, spending time with users. I mean, yes, we can ask them, we can do interviews and focus groups and surveys and diary studies, and they're great and they are definitely useful. But people are generally quite bad at saying what they really mean and not very good at explaining why they're doing things and why they think what they think. So I think the best way of getting at this is by doing research that observes people, is watching what they're doing. So that could be usability testing, it can be what we call contextual inquiries or contextual studies, so actually spending time out there in the field watching people do what they do. So if you're designing a new app for home engineers to go into homes and speak to customers, then you need to spend time out there with them. If you're designing something for paramedics, you need to spend days in an ambulance. So spending time with users to really understand why they're doing what they're doing and what they're thinking and how they're behaving. And that'll drive the insight that we need to design fantastic products. UX must start early. It needs to be kind of the first thing that's thought about, and this kind of goes back to what we were saying before about it needs to be intentional rather than consequential. So if you think about this continuum of the process of designing a product or a service, and as time goes by, our ability to make changes decreases. And at the same time, the cost to make those changes increases. Now, very often, we don't actually think about speaking to people until we get to the UAT point, by which point it's very expensive and very difficult to actually make any of the changes. However, if we're actually thinking about this as we go through the process, so we do a bit of sketching and then we put some paper in front of users and then we put together rough mock-ups and test those, and then we do some wireframes and test those, and then some high fidelity prototypes and test those, then we're mitigating that risk as we go through, and we are capturing those issues as early as possible when it's very cheap, very quick, very easy to make a change. You've probably seen the quote from Frank Lloyd Wright, the architect, who said it's much easier to remove a wall with an eraser than it is with a sledgehammer. So we need to be thinking about how we can make those changes early and do that testing early and often. We also need to just bear in mind that UX is not the same as UI. They're related and they're important, but it's not exactly the same thing. So there's many, many aspects that come into designing the UX. And this is just a selection of them, but we've got the research, we've got the testing, personas, interface design, storyboards, et cetera, et cetera. And they're all really crucial. Unfortunately, so often, the UX gets diluted down to it's the user interface, it's the visual design. And in doing that, we lose a lot of the value of user experience, and it dilutes the quality and the impact of the user experience. And then finally, I think we also need to consider that the UX doesn't end when somebody leaves the site or stops using the app that we're using. We need to have a wider view of the customer's experience. And that experience goes through from the trigger, what is it that kicks them off and starts them thinking about that journey right through to when they achieve their goal. So if we consider, I want to go away to Barcelona with my wife for the weekend, and yes, I go onto the BA site, and that is a really important part, and I'm booking my flight. I also need to consider all the extras, so actually how am I going to get from the airport into the city? And then I get to the airport, I need to get my boarding pass, so I'm then using the British Airways app. I'm then dropping my bags. Have you noticed how the airlines have dropped the word fast from bag drop now? I think it's just responding to user expectations. And then the experience when you get on board, maybe interacting with the technology when you're on the plane. Then you get off the plane, how do you find your bag? The experience of getting your bag. And it's only at that point there that you actually get to the goal. The goal isn't to use a website to book a ticket. The goal is much wider than that, and the journey is much wider than that. And we don't always have control over the whole journey. Hopefully somebody in the organization does, and we need to encourage that. But even in our roles, if we have responsibility over a specific touch point, we need to have an awareness of the end-to-end journey so that what we're producing gives a consistent and a cohesive experience across the whole journey. And there's a number of ways that you can do that, but it's important to look at that journey, understand it, and kind of map the emotions as you're going through that journey so we can see what's really working well and what's causing pain and how can we try to neutralize that pain. So, to wrap up then, 6 points, the UX must be intentional. It's got to involve the users. Unfortunately, the users don't always know what they want, so we need to dig a bit deeper. We must start that process early for the most maximum benefit. We need to think about more than just the user interface. It needs to be wider than that. And also an appreciation that the journey is wider than just the bit that we're doing. So I shall now hand over to Stephen, who'll tell you how all that translates in the real world.
Thanks. Okay, so this morning we've heard a lot about basically elevating the user within building products and paying more attention to what the user wants, putting the user front and center. And an expression of that is that the user experience, the UX, has to be really good. I'd like to talk about this a little bit from the perspective of, do you want to switch on to? Yeah. A little bit from the perspective of building an actual product. And talk about that. So the first thing to say is that it's really, really, really hard. And the reason for that is because I think, so I've thought long and hard about this, and I've spoken to loads of people about it, and I think it's really hard because building software comes from a world that was much more waterfall, and it was much more about getting things done. And it was much more about sticking to a plan and solving really hard engineering problems. And within that world, thinking about the user was a kind of thing you did at the end. And it was a kind of luxury or some kind of weird sort of frivolity that you would do. And that is really now changing. And it's changed. People were aware of this years ago, but it's surprising to see how long it takes for it to actually change in people's hearts, not just their minds. So the perspective that I'll be talking about today is the perspective from a small startup. So we've got a small team, we're 8 people. So we don't have to manage like a big team of hundreds of people or tens of people. So we're a little bit more flexible and more agile. But still, nevertheless, I think there's some lessons that we can maybe talk about, or just talk about the way we do things. So what is UX? Again, we've heard lots of different definitions this morning. I've got a couple here just to basically show you that the definitions themselves can really vary in length. So you could write an essay or a PhD paper on what UX design is. I've just got 3 examples here just to show you how hard it is to encapsulate something that's deceptively simple. I really like what Stephen spoke about earlier, about that it's kind of like a joke. If you have to explain it, then it's kind of not working. So it's like a good referee at a football game. It's kind of invisible, but something that makes you feel warm and fuzzy and something that helps you achieve what you want to achieve. Another thing that turns people off when they're building products is sort of big, complicated sort of schematics like this, and it just seems like such a big task that's too complex to do. Again, I would like to say that these are basically overcomplications. A nice way that we've found to look at UX is simply to have something like this, that it's about interaction, information, visual stuff, functionality, usability, typography, user interface, and it has to be part of your content strategy. That's as small as we've managed to sort of pull it down, that we're thinking about all those different aspects whenever we build something. I love this slide. It's stolen blatantly from Spotify. And I think actually everyone who's been on stage today has tried to express what's on this slide, namely that the way to build software in a proper agile way is to start small, build incrementally, and find out where you're going, rather than planning ahead, chopping it up into different parts, and then hoping that everything will work out. The way we're trying to do this is to actually try to go every stage of the way and incrementally iterate forward and make something better and better. Okay. As I was saying at the beginning, I think the reason for this is that when we first traditionally looked at users, or the whole question of a user in building software, it came from this sort of waterfall background, where the debate at the time, and this is in the sort of late 90s, was should the user interface and no interface, not experience, that wasn't even a consideration at the time, should the user interface come first or come last? And at the time, there was a movement to at least make engineers think that the interface should come first. So that led to the kind of proto-user story descriptions of saying, okay, what are the intentions of the user? What are the tasks they're trying to perform? And then, if you did a really good job, you would start to say, okay, we're going to set up some measurements to see how well people are performing, how well the tool lets them do what they're trying to do. And that kind of started to be the beginning of looking at what UX should be. Now, in an agile way of incorporating the user, this is what we're trying to do. Now, this is by no means perfect. Successful other startups use this. We try to stick with it as best we can. Again, some of it will be familiar with what you've already heard today. So I just wanted to go through a kind of structure, because people often from a sort of waterfall background will criticize Agile as being, quite loose in structure and not really having, not being rigorous enough. But I think you can put a kind of Agile structure around building software and incorporating the UX question. So what we try to do is we start with the persona work. I'll talk about personas in a little bit more depth in another couple of slides. But just to say this, people have been talking today about getting user feedback when you're building things, and also talking about the pitfalls of, the faster horse quote. Now, I think looking to users is a great idea, but sometimes it can be a bit daunting, and a good place to start off is just to make some assumptions and build a persona with this, and then take that persona out and check it against reality. So you can do that by interviewing people or talking to them, or ethnography, so just observing them, seeing what they're doing, but to see that the assumptions I'm making, this kind of person I'm fleshing out, does that person exist in reality, and have I got their problems right? So describing their problems is describing the user story and how they want to solve those problems. And then there's a new, I guess it's a newish kind of theory called jobs to be done theory. Maybe, has anyone heard of jobs to be done theory in the audience? No? Okay. Again, I'll go into more detail in a second, but it's a theory that comes from marketing, product marketing, but it's now creeping into product development more and more. We'll talk about that in more detail. Then the next thing is wireframes. So the first talk this morning, people were talking about the wealth of new prototyping tools that are coming about, and it's indeed the case. Here's another name, UX Pin is a tool we really like to use. And it just gives designers the opportunity to build wireframes really quickly nowadays and fast, because the thing where this sort of agile dream is rapid prototyping, so to come up with small sort of incremental versions of what you're trying to build that you can look at, judge, measure, and then say, no, not good, and then build on them. So wireframing tools really, really help with that, and there are more and more of them are available now, and this has only happened over the last, say, 2 or 3 years. So it's made this particular piece of an agile development a lot easier. Then throughout this, you should always make and show to the product owner. I won't go into the product owner too much, because that's another kind of conversation about product management. Product management, very briefly, is to say that, well, one way of expressing it is to say that in a startup you should have an inside team and an outside team. The outside team go out and find problems, bring them back to the inside team to solve. And the product owner or the product manager is the guy who sits in the middle, guy or girl who sits in the middle, and makes sure that decisions are being made that are in the good, for the good of the user or the customer, not for the good of the developers. Because sometimes it'll, or very often, it'll be, oh, we can only solve it like this, so let's do that, and you know, users be damned. So that's where the product owner comes in, to actually ensure that you're building something that people actually want. Then another thing is mood boarding for design. I think this is underestimated and neglected. Mood boards very often are just used for, say, logo design or what color scheme do you want on your website. But actually, mood boarding for design, I think, especially with the proliferation of all those new sort of wireframing tools, is actually becoming more and more important. So one of the things that strikes me is that if you come from a larger company background, very often your metaphors for user experience will be based on legacy desktop tools. So very often it'll be whatever Microsoft did, or whatever Oracle did, or whatever SAP did. And that's just because that's your affordance, that's your expectation horizon. But more and more users now are accessing tools via browsers, and there's a whole new kind of aesthetic coming about with, from SaaS tools that have solved interface problems, have solved design problems in a browser, and that's very, very different to how the old kind of desktop install tools have done things. And again, this might sound crazy, but it's a more prevalent problem, I think, than you'd think. Then, of course, there's also user testing, so actually showing it to your prospective users, getting them to play around with wireframes, watching them, again, ethnography, or talking to them, asking them questions, coming up with a little interview, and measuring what people are doing. Then it's always taking stock, looking at all the things you've done. Very often people will do research without actually looking at it afterwards. This is another big problem. And then the sort of magic word in this whole process is iteration. So take all that stuff, iterate, make a new version, go out. Right, just to talk about personas briefly. So for personas, it's worthwhile to actually make your persona information as graphic and visual and as photographs based and as detailed as you can. So this is, creating personas is not coming up with who's our main demographic. So there's a cool quote on this that if you took Ozzy Osbourne and Prince Charles, they'd actually be demographically really similar. So they're kind of same age, they've got sort of same amount of money, they like to actually, you know, go to the countryside, but have to do lots of public appearances, they're on TV a lot, all this kind of stuff. But actually, persona-wise, they'd be very, very different. And personas goes straight through from this sort of superficial from this sort of psycho-demographic. So where did someone live? Are they single? How old are they? What's their gender? But all the way through to things like, you know, what are their hobbies? What kind of TV stuff do they like? If they were to describe themselves as an animal, what would they choose? What kind of clothes do they wear? What's their favorite website? What keeps them up at night? You know, those kind of things, to start fleshing this out and make this persona more and more lifelike and realistic. Now, the reason for this is that whenever you hit a snag in the road and you're not sure where to go with building the product, that you've got something you can hold on to, and you can go and give them a name and go, no, Johnny would never do that. And if you have a disagreement, you can at least use all the kind of stuff you've got as evidence as to why they wouldn't do that. So no, someone who likes Sherlock would never go to a website that's all sort of red and pink or something, etc. So this kind of culminates then in a user story. So what is a user story? Again, zooming right out, we can say that a user story is a kind of short story that encapsulates a need or a piece of functionality in the language of the user, and that's the really important thing. How does a user story, how is it scripted? What's the format? It doesn't really matter. It's a skill, I think, that you learn over time. The problem set in user stories is being too detailed or not detailed enough, but it's about sharpening a user story and writing it in an indicative form, so not floating ideas, because developers hate that and it really doesn't help them either, but writing definitive storylines, so user wants to click on a button so that they can see what date it is. Try to get down to that kind of level, but start vague, and then as you go on and as you build the product, get more and more concrete. At its heart, and there are things like Cucumber, if you've heard of that, where you can actually start to take user stories, sort of English grammar, and almost turn it into code, where you can say things like, as a user, I want to be able to do functionality goal, so that, motivation, reason. But user stories, super important, and again, they're a document that changes over time, but that you can always refer to and see where you are, and always check against, is the tool we're trying to build, or the product we're trying to make, is it actually fulfilling what the user's trying to do in the story that we created? It just gives you that rigor and discipline to know where you're going. Now, finally, jobs to be done theory. I really love this theory. I think it's very, very clever. It's hard to talk about because it's fairly recent, so there's not a lot of snappy sort of descriptions and examples. But it comes from an idea that says that people don't buy a drill, they actually buy a hole in the wall. And this is from a kind of marketing perspective. So people don't buy a drink, they buy the quenching of their thirst, for example. So in the marketing world, big consumer brands have spent decades thinking about how can we fill that gap. So why drink Coke instead of Pepsi? Why drink Sprite instead of 7-Up or whatever? And the marketing message will be not focusing on the task of just actually drinking, but focusing on the deeper thing someone wants to achieve by having used a certain drink. So again, there's a kind of famous story from Steve Jobs back in the day when he was thinking about the difference between Coke and Pepsi. They did some ethnography studies, and they realized that if you went to visit people at home and they poured you a drink, so this is in the 70s and 80s, if they had Coke in the house, they would pour it out in front of you and give you the Coke. And if they had Pepsi, they would pour it in the kitchen and bring it through to you. And that's because those two brands, the job they're doing are not just quenching your thirst or giving someone a drink. They're actually about indicating status, for example. Or a job to be done can be about, very, very often, I think you'll find in building software, tools will have an obvious kind of catalog of tasks that they help you do. But actually, in a deeper level, the job to be done that the parlance says that you hire this software for, is actually a much deeper, mostly a psychological job. So, for example, if you're building some kind of software that automates a workflow, which many of us are, it could be that workflow is particularly anxiety-inducing, so that the tool you're actually building should be about understanding that the users of this tool, the job they're trying to do with this tool is actually stop their anxiety and actually feel that if they log in and use your tool, they're in a kind of safe zone where nothing bad can happen, where they can't break the internet or delete really important files, etc. And that awareness can flow into your user experience and should flow. So something as banal as choosing colors. It could be soothing colors in the background, but if someone's about to do something wrong or something that could be catastrophic, there could be a different color that really jars with the rest as a kind of soft alarm that goes, hey, be careful now, you're about to do something that could have bad consequences. So that's, I hope, a little bit of an explanation of what jobs to be done theory is. Wireframes, again, we've spoken about this, so a lot of people have spoken about this today on stage. Just suffice it to say that there are more and more tools, InDesign, Sketchart, UXPin, there's so many of them now. And they just make that part of building something rapidly so much easier than before. So there's just fewer excuses to not use them. They're good, really do it. Okay, then just to encapsulate again that the product management piece is always about product ownership. So someone is responsible for what the thing has to do, and that requires research, data, care, the look of the product, KPIs, and one way to do that is to talk to people like user vision and talk to real users and get your user testing in. Mood boards, that's the piece that really should come at the end. So that's that kind of legacy moment where you're thinking about colors, because again, we've got the wireframing tools nowadays that can do this and can do it fast. So in the past, very often people have thought that design's more what things look like rather than how they actually behave, or what they do, or what the functionality is. And they would go, hey, we've got a cool logo for this, and this is the colors, and blah, 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 right at the front. And it looks like, especially to non-technical management, it looks like you've achieved something, but it's actually deceptive. Okay, my last message here is, again, it's always about taking stock of what you're doing and then iterating forward. Thanks very much. Okay, I think we've got some time for some questions, if you guys want to do so.
But we can't talk about big data.
Yeah.
It's just a quick question. The Henry J. Ford quote about if they'd have asked for a faster horse. Do we need to educate the end users as well in all of this? As part of the journey?
I don't think necessarily about education. I think it's, it's difficult because it really depends on what it is that's being designed, what the product service is. There may be occasions where there needs to be some understanding of the context that it's being built in. But I think it's really about, kind of as Stephen was saying, getting below what the user can maybe communicate verbally, and trying to understand what the drivers are behind that, what the motivations, what the needs are. And
I agree. It's a much maligned quote, actually. It's a famous quote, and again, it was Steve Jobs who always quoted it, and people aren't actually even sure if it was Henry Ford in the first place. But when people say that quote, in my experience, it's a kind of continuum. They either mean, we don't need to do market research. People don't know shit. We'll just do this. Or it goes through to, people don't know what they think they know. And actually, what Stephen's saying, you actually have to, and this is where jobs to be done really comes in, you have to dig deeper. And I think there's two ways to do that. One way is to have really deep contextual interviewing techniques, and the other is much more an ethnographic approach. Now, ethnography, just the word itself sounds, infusively posh, but it's basically, it comes from, there's a Unilever company called Veleda in the 90s, and what they did was, instead of, everything about Unilever cleaning products is about communicating to females of the house that if they don't clean the house, their families will die, right? That's the entirety of all the advertising, and that your husband's an idiot who doesn't know what to buy, so you buy this thing and you'll save the family. And people started to sort of rile against that politically. So instead of doing the sort of normal market research, of going out and interviewing people with top-down structured questionnaires, they actually set up some cameras in people's kitchens. And they realized by watching what they were doing in the kitchen that they could come up with product ideas where they'd not spoken a word to them, actually, but just did this ethnography. So you just observe someone's behavior and then sit with a panel of clever clogs people and come up with new products. And then again, go out, test them, and then come up with the copy around them. So I think the faster horse is really in that kind of realm. I think it shouldn't be used as an excuse not to talk to people or to demand too much from people. It should be a kind of awareness piece that you need to talk to people, but you need to go beyond what they're just kind of saying.
Yeah. And I think that that observation, the ethnography, can be used to understand kind of fundamental needs, but also fairly minor things. So there was a project that I heard about where they were trying to build an interface for paramedics to use in ambulances. And to cut a long story short, it wasn't being used. And when they actually got out there and actually watched how people were using it, they would realize that it was because they designed this very nice touchscreen interface, but actually when the paramedics were there with latex gloves on, covered with blood and various other nice things, it wouldn't work. They're sort of taking off gloves, doing this, putting more gloves on, and the whole premise was fundamentally flawed. And that's not something that you would necessarily get by sitting down and just asking somebody about the way they do their job and how it works. You actually need to experience it.
Hi, I was just wondering, say you're working or designing a product, do you think, and there's a team of people, do you think you need one UX specialist, or do you think there should be, everybody should buy into that, or?
That's a great question. To be honest with you, I don't think there's any best practice answer to that question. It's such a recent thing, and again, like if you read blogs and you're into Apple products or whatever, you think that everyone does this, but it's actually super surprising to see how recent it is, and how very often the UX designer is like the front end dude or some designer they had for some logo or something and ended up there, or it's really hard. I was talking to one of the founders of a startup called Intercom, who are doing really well, an Irish company. They've raised something like $50 million. They're going great guns, and they were saying that there was not one UX designer in Ireland. Not one, and they tried to hire, and something like 20 people turned up, and so it's really hard to say. I think it's just such a recent discipline. I think it's going that way, that people are starting to really be really interested in it, and people are starting to hyphenate the word designer. It used to be designer, now it's graphic designer, interface designer, UX designer, etc. And I think as that hyphenation continues and becomes more and more sort of niche, that people will know more, and that'll be better. At the moment, I think it is a little bit of a product manager, back end dude, front end, salespeople. Will go, no, someone said they wanted a cancel button there. Can we just make this? And so it's a bit of a hodgepodge, but unifying it's a big task. But it's a great question. I think it's just too early to say.
I think I'll just add to that. I think the answer is both. You need to have somebody in the team who has the experience of the methods, the techniques, the approaches, but the job should never belong solely to them, the responsibility solely to them. And I think successful products and services require everybody to be sharing a vision of the user. And I was reading an article yesterday about Airbnb and how they're actually moving away from being design-led to be user-led. So rather than they used to have designers who acted as like an internal consultancy and then go out to the different business units. And what they're doing now is getting rid of that and just having one project manager in every product team whose sole responsibility is to represent the user. And that is their job. And they are evangelizing within the teams and building up that awareness and building up that motivation. So yes, some things require specialist skills and need to be people there to do it, but it has to be something that everyone's on board with.
To finish, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.